My family ignored me for being a welder and abandoned my dying uncle, but when he left me $500K in a cabin, my brother forged a will. My parents sued me, and I exposed them all. I'm 24 years old. I work as a welder and occasionally as a hunting guide, and I need to tell this story because what happened when my great-uncle Raymond died basically showed me who my family really is. I guess I should start from the beginning. When I was a kid and it was already obvious that I didn't fit into the perfect mold my parents had in mind for their children. My family has always been like that, one of those families that cares a lot about appearances and professional success. My dad, James, is a lawyer, super successful, and my mom, Catherine, was a registered nurse until she retired a few years ago. They have this obsession with all their kids being professionals with college degrees and office jobs. My brother Vincent owns a chain of gyms, like 3 or 4 locations that generate pretty good money for him, and he's always talking about expanding and opening more. Julian, my other brother, has a tech startup, and although I'm not really sure what his company does exactly, he acts like he's the next Steve Jobs or something. And then there's my sister Nicole, who married Andrew, a corporate lawyer who comes from a family with money and basically lives off that. And then there's me, Ryan, the welder. The guy who wears steel-toed boots and comes home with dirty hands. The one who prefers spending his weekends in the woods guiding hunters instead of at some country club. I don't know. I just was never interested in college. I tried one semester because my parents practically forced me to, but I hated every second of it. I dropped out, got an apprentice job at a welding shop, and eventually got certified. I actually like the work, and I earn enough to live comfortably, but to my family it's like I'm a total failure. Family dinners were the worst. Vincent talking about his sales numbers, Julian bragging about some investment he secured, Nicole showing off pictures of her new house or her latest trip, and me sitting there while my mom asked me in that disappointed voice if I'd considered going back to school yet. My dad didn't even ask about my work. He basically ignored me unless he needed someone to help him move something heavy or fix something at his house. Then he'd call me. The only one in the entire family who treated me like a normal person was my great-uncle Raymond. Raymond was my paternal grandmother's brother. He must have been like 78 years old when all this started. The guy had been a lawyer too, just like my dad, but he retired like 20 years ago and moved to a cabin in the country. He had this incredible piece of land, like 70 acres of pure forest and nature, with a cabin he'd renovated himself over the years. It was beautiful, seriously. The kind of place where you can go days without seeing another person. Raymond and I always had a good relationship. Since I was a kid, he'd take me hunting and fishing. He taught me how to track animals, how to read the forest, all those things my parents considered a waste of time. He understood why I preferred working with my hands instead of sitting in an office all day. He'd tell me he'd spent 40 years behind a desk and that the best years of his life had been after retiring and moving to the country. Sometimes, when I had a free weekend, I'd drive the 2 hours to his cabin and we'd spend time together. He'd tell me stories from his days as a lawyer, and I'd help him with projects on the property, fixing things or building something new. The rest of my family basically forgot Raymond existed. My parents visited him maybe once a year, if that, and my siblings never went. Nicole said the place gave her horror movie vibes, and she didn't understand how anyone could live so far from civilization. Vincent once said it was a waste that Raymond had all that land and didn't develop it commercially. Julian didn't even pretend to be interested. Everything changed. Like 2.5 years ago, when Raymond was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he called to tell me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I remember I had to sit down because I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The doctors gave him like 6 months to a year, depending on how he responded to treatment. I asked him what he needed, how I could help, and he told me the only thing he wanted was not to die alone in a hospital. I told my family that same night. I called them all, explained the situation, told them Raymond was sick and probably didn't have much time left. And you know what? They basically said things like, "That's sad, and let us know if there's a funeral," and went on with their lives. Vincent was busy opening a new gym. Julian had some funding round for his startup or something. Nicole was planning a trip to Europe. My parents said they were very busy, but they'd try to visit him soon, which they never did. Well, not until much later when it was already too late. So basically, I became Raymond's primary caregiver. It wasn't like I lived with him. but I started visiting almost every weekend, and sometimes during the week too. I cut back my hours at work so I could spend more time with him. I took him to his medical appointments, helped him with shopping, cooked meals he could digest without problems, and mainly just kept him company. He had a dog, Maisie, an old golden retriever who was basically his best friend, and I made sure she was well taken care of too. Raymond got worse faster than we expected. By 4 months, he couldn't do much for himself, and by 6 months, he could barely get out of bed most days. It was hard, I'm not gonna lie, watching him deteriorate like that. But he kept his good humor most of the time. He said he'd lived a good life and had no regrets. He'd tell me stories from when he was young, about my grandmother before she died, about crazy cases he'd had as a lawyer. We spent a lot of time together in those months, probably more than in all the previous years combined. And during all that time, my family still didn't show up. I called my mom several times to tell her things were getting bad, that if they wanted to see him before it was too late, they needed to come soon. She always had an excuse. That she was tired, that my dad had an important case, that next week for sure, and next week never came. But the weird thing, the truly weird thing, is that like 7 months after Raymond was diagnosed, suddenly everyone started calling, asking about the cabin. Vincent sent me a message asking how much the property was worth. Julian called to ask if Raymond had mentioned anything about his plans for the land after he died. Nicole, who had never in her life shown interest in the place, asked me if anyone knew if Raymond had a will and what it said. I wasn't an idiot. I mean, it was obvious what was happening. Suddenly they realized Raymond had a property that was probably worth quite a bit of money, like maybe $500,000 or more, considering the size of the land and the location, and everyone wanted to make sure they were going to get their share. It made me a little sick, honestly, because none of them had lifted a finger to help him when he was suffering, but now that he was dying, suddenly they cared about his inheritance. Turns out Raymond knew exactly what was happening. One day, must have been like 8 months after the diagnosis, he told me he'd called his lawyer, Mr. Cooper, to update his will. He said he'd thought a lot about what he wanted to do with his things, and that he'd made a decision. He didn't tell me what the will said, but he looked at me with those tired eyes and said thank you for taking care of him, that it meant more than I could imagine, and that he hoped I'd understand his reasons when the time came. I didn't know what he meant by that until later, but at that moment I just told him he didn't have to thank me for anything, that I was doing it because I loved him, not because I expected anything in return. And it was true. You know, I wasn't thinking about inheritances or anything like that. I just wanted my great-uncle not to spend his last months alone and scared. Things got weirder when my parents organized a family dinner like a month before Raymond died. They said it was important for us all to be together to discuss Raymond's situation, which seemed super ironic to me considering none of them had wanted to discuss anything for the last 9 months. But I went, because Raymond told me to go, to keep the peace. That dinner was a disaster. Vincent started by saying the family should consider selling Raymond's property after he died because none of us are really going to use it, and the money could be divided fairly. Julian agreed, adding that it could be a good investment if they sold it to the right buyer. Nicole said she and Andrew would be interested in keeping the cabin as a vacation home if the price was reasonable. My mom said something about how it would be nice to keep the property in the family, but she understood if they had to sell it. I stayed quiet most of the time, but when Vincent asked me directly what I thought, I told him I thought it was incredibly disrespectful to be planning what to do with Raymond's things when he was still alive. That maybe they should worry about visiting him, instead of counting his money before he died. That obviously didn't go over well. Vincent told me I was being dramatic, that we all knew Raymond was going to die soon, and it was important to be practical about these things. Julian said something condescending about how I didn't understand how family finances worked. Nicole literally rolled her eyes and said, I always had to make everything about my feelings. And my parents didn't say anything to defend me, they just changed the subject. I left that dinner feeling disgusted. I drove straight to Raymond's cabin, even though it was already late, and stayed with him that night. I told him what had happened, and he just shook his head and said it didn't surprise him at all. He told me people show their true colors when there's money involved, and that he'd learned that in his years as a lawyer. He also told me, and I remember this perfectly, that he'd make sure things turned out the way they should, and that I shouldn't worry about anything. Raymond died on a Thursday morning, like 3 weeks after that dinner. I was there. I'd spent the night at the cabin because I knew he didn't have much time left. Maisie was lying next to his bed, and I was sitting in a chair beside him. He just went peacefully in his sleep. No pain. The doctors had said it would probably be like that with the amount of morphine he was taking. I called hospice. They did what they had to do, and then I called my family to let them know. The reaction was weird, you know. It was like they didn't know what to feel. They cried a little, said appropriate things about what a great man Raymond had been, but I could feel that they were mainly thinking about the will. Vincent asked me if I knew when the will reading would be literally 3 hours after Raymond had died. Julian asked if I knew where Raymond kept his important documents. It was disgusting. The funeral was small. Raymond didn't have many living friends. Most people his age had already died. There was my family, some neighbors from the area, Mr. Cooper, his lawyer, and a couple of people who'd worked with him decades ago. My siblings looked uncomfortable in their suits, like they had more important places to be. Nicole spent half the service checking her phone. Only my parents seemed genuinely sad, but even that felt more like sadness that someone from their generation had died, not sadness about Raymond specifically. The will reading was scheduled for the following week at Mr. Cooper's office. We were all there, my entire family, which was rare because usually we couldn't coordinate for everyone to be in the same place at the same time. But when there's inheritance involved, suddenly everyone has time and their schedules, you know what I mean? Mr. Cooper was an older man, maybe 70, super professional and serious. He had us sit down, offered condolences, and then opened the folder with the will. He started reading the standard parts, you know, all the legal jargon about being of sound mind and all that. And then he got to the distributions. The first thing he said was that Raymond had left the cabin, the 70 acres of land, and $200,000 specifically designated for property renovations to Ryan Anderson, meaning me. He also officially left me Maisie, although she was already with me at that point. The rest of his estate, which included some investments and savings totaling like $400,000 or so, was going to be divided among 3 charitable organizations he'd supported for years. The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I was in shock, honestly, because Raymond had told me he'd updated his will, but I never imagined he'd leave me all that. The property alone was easily worth between $500,000 and $600,000, and with the additional $200,000 for renovations, he'd basically left me almost $1 million in assets. And then everything exploded. Vincent was the first to speak, his voice rising in volume with each word, saying this was ridiculous. That obviously I had manipulated Raymond when he was vulnerable. Julian agreed, adding that a will made when someone is on strong medication probably wasn't valid. Nicole started crying, those dramatic tears she could always produce when she wanted something, saying it wasn't fair, that Raymond was everyone's uncle and the inheritance should be divided equally. My dad was quiet, but his face was red, and I could see the vein in his forehead that always bulged when he was angry. My mom looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like disappointment mixed with fury. She was the one who finally spoke, in that nurse voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable but was actually furious, saying that clearly Raymond hadn't been thinking clearly, and that the right thing would be for me to share the inheritance with my siblings. Mr. Cooper intervened before I could say anything. He explained very calmly that Raymond had been completely lucid when he updated his will, that it had been over 8 months ago, long before medication affected his judgment, and that he personally could attest that Raymond knew exactly what he was doing. He also mentioned that Raymond had anticipated there might be disputes, so he'd written a letter explaining his reasons, which Mr. Cooper proceeded to read. The letter was short but direct. Raymond explained that during his illness, only one person in the family had shown they truly cared about his well-being, and that person was me. But that he appreciated that I'd taken care of him without expecting anything in return, that he valued the hours I'd spent with him during the last years. Not just during his illness, but before too, he said. The rest of the family had made it clear they only cared about his money, not him as a person, and that's why he'd decided they wouldn't receive anything from his estate. He ended by saying he hoped I'd use the property to find the same peace he'd found there, and that I shouldn't let anyone make me feel guilty about his decision. I had tears running down my face when Mr. Cooper finished reading the letter. Not because of the money or property, but because Raymond had understood exactly how all this would be and had tried to protect me even after death. But my family wasn't interested in Raymond's feelings or his reasoning. As soon as Mr. Cooper folded the letter, they all started yelling at the same time. Vincent was saying he was going to fight this, that he was going to get a lawyer and prove Raymond had been manipulated. Julian was already on his phone, I guess looking for lawyers who specialized in inheritance disputes. Nicole was crying louder now, saying things like, "How was she?" I'm going to explain to Andrew they weren't going to receive anything, as if her millionaire husband really needed Raymond's inheritance. My parents looked between embarrassed and furious, and my mom kept repeating that I had to do the right thing, that I had to think about the family. I got up and walked out of the office without saying a word. What was I going to say? There was nothing I could say that would change how they felt or make them understand. This wasn't about the money. I drove straight to Raymond's cabin, well, my cabin now I guess, and sat on the porch with Maisie by my side for hours, just processing everything. The following days were a nightmare. I was bombarded with calls and messages. Vincent sent me like 50 messages demanding I call him back. Julian sent me a long email explaining why legally I was obligated to share the inheritance, even though he clearly didn't understand how wills worked. Nicole showed up at my apartment crying, saying I was her brother and I couldn't believe I'd be so selfish to keep everything. My parents were different, more manipulative. My mom called to say she understood. Raymond had wanted to reward me for taking care of him, but that $200,000 or $300,000 for me would be more than enough, and the rest should be divided among everyone. My dad, using his lawyer voice, explained to me that although legally the will was valid, morally I had a responsibility to take care of my family, and that they'd raised me and paid for my education, even though technically they only paid for that one semester I hated, and that I owed them this. I ignored everything. I changed my phone number, stopped answering emails, basically cut off contact. Mr. Cooper had told me I could take possession of the property immediately, so I started the process of moving. I hired someone to help me pack my apartment and moved everything to the cabin. It was perfect, honestly, because I worked as a welder and could get work at several shops in the area, and my hunting guide work was now even more convenient living in the woods. But my family wasn't going to give up that easily. Like 2 weeks after moving in, I installed security cameras around the property because something told me I was going to need them. And I was right. 4 days later, the cameras caught my mom, Nicole, and Andrew trying to enter the cabin. They had a key that apparently my mom had found in my grandmother's things. I don't know. But it didn't work because I'd changed all the locks. In the video you can see them talking to each other, clearly frustrated, and then Andrew literally tried to force the door. He wasn't successful because I'd installed good quality locks. But the fact that he tried was enough. I saved the video, sent it to a lawyer I'd hired, and also sent copies to all 3 of them with a message saying if they showed up on my property without permission again, I was going to report them for trespassing. My mom called me from a friend's number, crying and saying they just wanted to see the property, that they had memories there too, which was an obvious lie because she'd visited Raymond like 5 times in 20 years. I told her those memories didn't give them the right to enter my house illegally, and that if they wanted to visit, they had to ask my permission like anyone else, which I obviously wasn't going to give because I didn't want them near me. Then Nicole changed tactics and sent me a super sweet message saying she understood I was upset, but that she really loved the cabin and would be willing to buy it from me. She offered me $100,000, which was absolutely ridiculous considering the property was worth at least $500,000. When I told her I wasn't interested in selling, she raised her offer to $150,000 and then to $175,000. When I told her the property wasn't for sale at any price, she blocked me everywhere. Julian was the most creative, I guess. And he showed up at Mr. Cooper's office with a document that, supposedly, was an earlier version of Raymond's will, where the inheritance was divided equally among all nieces and nephews. The document looked official, had Raymond's signature and everything. Julian argued that this will was more recent than the one Mr. Cooper had, and therefore this should be the valid one. The only problem was, it was completely fake. Mr. Cooper knew immediately because the format didn't match his documents, The signature was obviously a forgery if you compared it to other signatures of Raymond's. And the date on the document didn't make sense because it was from a time when Raymond had been hospitalized and Mr. Cooper had records of all the documents they'd signed together. Basically, Julian had forged a will, which is a serious crime. Mr. Cooper called me immediately and explained the situation. He told me he had an obligation to report this to authorities because it was fraud, and he asked if I wanted to proceed with criminal charges against Julian. I'm not gonna lie. I hesitated a bit because despite everything, Julian was my brother. But then I thought about everything that had happened, how they'd treated Raymond, how they'd treated me, and I told him yes, to proceed. The police investigated and found that Julian had paid someone on some shady website to forge the document. They had emails, money transfers, everything. Julian was arrested and charged with forgery and fraud. My family, of course, blamed me for this too, saying I'd ruined Julian's life for being vindictive, completely ignoring the fact that Julian had committed a federal crime trying to steal my inheritance. Julian's case didn't go to trial. His lawyer negotiated a deal where he pleaded guilty in exchange for probation, a big fine, and like 500 hours of community service. It was also on record that he'd committed fraud, which apparently affected his startup because some investors pulled out when they found out. Vincent sent me a message saying I destroyed Julian's business and he hoped I was happy. I replied that Julian had destroyed his own business by committing a crime, and then I blocked him. That was like 8 months ago. I haven't spoken to any of them since then. I changed my number again because somehow Vincent got the new one, and now I basically live here at the cabin with Maisie. I'm using the money Raymond left me to renovate the property. I fixed the roof that had leaks, updated the electrical system, and I'm working on building a proper workshop for my welding equipment. I get quite a bit of work as a hunting guide during the season, and the rest of the year I do welding projects for people in the area. I earn less than I used to, but my expenses are also lower now that I own my house, and honestly, I'm much happier. I wake up every morning, have coffee on the porch looking at the forest, spend the day working on things that matter to me, and I don't have to deal with my family's drama. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, cutting off contact completely. My parents are older, and I know eventually they're going to die, and maybe I'll regret not trying to repair the relationship. But then I remember how they made me feel my entire life, like I wasn't good enough because I didn't follow the path they wanted for me. I remember how they treated Raymond when he was dying, and how their only concern after his death was the money. And then I realize I don't owe them anything. Raymond taught me something important in his last months. He told me family isn't about blood. It's about who's there when you really need them. He was there for me when everyone made me feel like a failure. I was there for him when he was alone and scared. That's real family, not sharing last names or DNA. Last week I was working in the workshop and found an old box of Raymond's with photos from when he was young. There was a photo of him in his lawyer's office, wearing a suit, surrounded by legal books and documents. He looked successful, but not happy. And then I found a photo of him here at the cabin, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, with Maisie by his side, really smiling. The difference was noticeable. I think Raymond understood something the rest of my family will never understand. Success isn't about how much money you have or what title you have on your business card. It's about living a life that makes you happy, about being surrounded by people who value you for who you are, not for what you can give them. He found that peace here, in this cabin, away from everyone's expectations, and now I've found it too. I guess in the end Raymond gave me much more than a property and money. He gave me permission to live my life on my own terms, and showed me it's okay to walk away from toxic people, even if those people are your family. And for that, I'll always be grateful to him.